Okay, my name is Sara Smith. I'm a professor of history at American River College. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and today's date is August 8th, 2023. So let's start off by establishing the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what's your date of birth?
My name is Cassandra Arlene Tabianini. I use she, her, they, them pronouns, and I was born on November 20th, 1995.
So how old does that make you?
27.
So tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies? What do you like to do?
In my spare time, I write for both personal and hopefully someday professional projects. I like doing stuff with my hands, creating in any capacity, be it crafting, painting, just sketching and doodling. Just like using my hands to create anything I can. Um,
Anything else you'd like to say about your interests and hobbies?
I'm a pretty big film nerd. Um, Most people that I know tend to think of me as a bit of a snob. I think that that's an unfair descriptor. I just have standards.
Okay, where did you grow up and where do you live now?
I grew up in downtown Sacramento, in Southside Park neighborhood, and I live in South Sacramento now, just off of Florin Road. So I've lived in Sacramento my entire life. It is everything I've known in terms of living situations, but I'm hoping to change that in the near future.
Where do you currently attend college and what do you study?
I'm currently attending Sac City here. Um, I'm on a bit of a hiatus. I graduated in 2021 with an associate's in sciences for design and digital media, but I've since sort of changed my trajectory and I'm now studying biology. But this fall term, I'm probably not going to be taking any classes as I prepare to transfer to San Jose State next spring.
That's a big change.
Yeah,
What made you decide to switch your course of study?
spending a lot of time in the pandemic alone, thinking about how I would be able to function as a freelance or incorporated artist in some kind of fashion, made me realize that doing art for money was kind of detrimental to my enjoyment and passion, and that trying to pursue an artistic career path would kind of ruin it for me. And so I thought about other things that I felt capable of doing, felt confident that I should do, that were necessary, that maybe not everybody else would be willing to do. So I'm going to pursue a path in biological sciences. I want to be a coroner and work in morgues and coroner's offices, work on autopsies and such.
Do you mind if I ask how you came to that decision to be a coroner?
I like dead stuff, and it doesn't make me uncomfortable, both psychologically and physically. It's pretty stable in terms of it not going away anytime soon, which is something that I have to think about as a person who's going to need specific medical care for her entire life. And not a lot of people are willing to do it, so I figured that impaction in terms of finding work is not going to be horrible once I actually get a degree.
I've interviewed, I think, at least one other person who's also considering going into being a coroner. So it's interesting. So you said you're preparing to transfer to San Jose State. When did you start at a community college?
I started at Sac City the fall directly after I graduated high school in 2014, and I started as a film major, which didn't pan out. And then I took a hiatus for about a year and a half, and I came back and did video game design and design and digital media here, and the program was nice. I enjoyed what I studied. I liked almost all of my professors, but as I aforementionedly stated, it just didn't seem like it was something I wanted to do as a career path.
So how long were you in community college? And you were mainly at Sac City, right?
I've taken one course at Folsom Lake College, but commute-wise, it just was the most efficient to go here, since it's always been closest to home. So I've been a student on record for 7 years now. Excuse me, 7? I guess that math adds up. No, pardon. 9 years. So I've been a student here for 9 years, but I haven't taken courses every semester that I've been enrolled at Sac City College. There's been times where I just worked, times where I was kind of between graduating and deciding that I wanted to study biology. There was a few semesters where I just worked and didn't take any courses. And as I said earlier, I'm probably not going to be taking any courses in the fall, but I think I'm technically still a student here.
And were you full-time or part-time, or did it depend?
It's all over the place. My academic career has been inconsistent, to say the least, but I'm hoping to sort of streamline that moving forward as I get closer to my 30s here.
So can you tell me about how you identify with regard to your social identities, broadly speaking, so race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, ability, religion, and so on?
Yeah. I'm white, all European in terms of my heritage. I identify as a non-binary trans femme. I'm a lesbian, and I was raised Catholic, but I am no longer practicing.
So a couple of follow-up questions. What do you mean when you say that you're a lesbian with regard to your sexual orientation? Whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, I have found that about 99.9% of the time, I find myself attracted to both romantically, emotionally, and sexually to women on basis of identity more than anything else. I find femininity as a social identity to be attractive.
So you said you identify as non-binary and trans femme, and that you use they, she pronouns. Can you elaborate a little bit on what all of that means to you and explain your pronouns some?
Yeah. So I'm non-binary. I don't feel that I necessarily gravitate towards traditional quote-unquote womanhood on a hyper-regular basis. I like presenting very feminine, but the way that I fit into social constructs tends to be a little loose, I suppose. I don't find myself in situations both professionally and socially that are very rigid in any kind of binary fashion. I felt very distant from ideas of gender for a lot of my life. I like to make a lot of jokes about how when I was a kid, people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a Komodo dragon, which, looking back on it, makes a lot of sense. I use she and they pronouns because they feel good to hear in reference to myself. They're comforting, I suppose. There's not a lot of depth that I can really think of on that. I just like the way they sound. They make me feel like me. And so that's what I ask people to use.
So do you tend towards one pronoun or the other, or do you sort of like them equally, or use them equally?
I use them equally. I tend to sort of adjust what I request based on whatever social circle I'm in. We're still sort of getting to a point as a culture where using they, them, and non-binary pronouns, non-gender conforming terminology is still new and difficult for a lot of people. So in situations where I feel it is easier for coworkers or family members or a cashier at a restaurant or somebody I run into on the street that I haven't seen in a little bit. If it's easier for them to just use she, her and think of me as a woman, then I usually will go with that just for the sake of simplicity. It doesn't make me uncomfortable to have that identity for these people, but it mitigates the possibility that they're going to screw up, which will make me uncomfortable. But in circles where I have friends that are a little bit more modern with their thinking, so to speak, they will flip-flop in the middle of sentences. It'll be context sensitive. It will be whatever sort of, I like to say, whatever energy I'm sort of putting out in that exact moment is what they'll use. And it's all over the place. I do have friends who will use they and she in the same sentence, both referring to me. So it's variable and it's context sensitive.
So if you had your sort of preferences met in full, would you like that to be the case for everybody, where people can more like easily kind of move between they, using they and she pronouns and how they refer to you?
Yeah, I think that that would be really nice to have for myself and most certainly for a lot of other people. I know that for me, I'm comfortable with both, and if I have people who only use one, that's fine with me. But I have friends and people I've known through various circles, and I'm sure plenty of people I don't know and probably never will, who are more particular and have more specific preferences. And I think that if we as a culture can get to a point where using multiple different preferred pronouns for the same person is easy and normalized, that will be incredibly beneficial for a substantially ignored group of people.
So how would you compare, if you can, the experiences of trans femininity to cis femininity?
That's
Very
an interesting
more
question.
theoretical.
Yeah, very theoretical on one of those. So I suppose that the thing that comes to mind the most is that there are certain things that I, whether or not they are true, feel that I have to do as a trans femme person if I want to present femme, if I want to be seen as feminine or womanly by family members or friends or coworkers or supervisors, that a lot of cis women that I know and have observed don't need to do. Today I spent a lot of time getting ready and I'm dressed very traditionally feminine, which is something that I have to do if I want to be respected in certain circles. I can't just put on jeans and a t-shirt and a pair of sneakers and put my hair back in a ponytail and call it a day, because people will use any factor either subconsciously or consciously, and they will misgender me, they will misjudge me. There's a lack of respect when I don't put in the effort that may have been expected for cis women 20, 30 years ago in sort of corporate circles or in high-end fashion circles or social circles. And it can be frustrating, and that's definitely something that I have to sort of balance on a daily basis, is whether the effort of presenting in a specific way balances out with the stress of not doing so and the consequences of that.
Is there anything else you would like to say in response to that question? Sort of how you would distinguish between an experience of trans femininity and cis femininity?
I think it generally comes back to things that are similar to what I previously mentioned, just in terms of sort of social terms, words that are used sort of very simplistically and subconsciously by a lot of people. We have a tendency in California specifically to use casually terms like bro and dude and man just sort of thrown into our colloquial language, which for a lot of people is fine. I don't know personally any cisgender women who are bothered by those terms because there's no pre-existing assumption, be it subconsciously or consciously, that that term is being used in reference to their gender assigned at birth. And that can be stressful as a trans femme person to have to be sort of particular about that. And a lot of people are sometimes quietly bothered by the idea that certain terms just aren't comfortable for certain people. And that can be frustrating.
Can you elaborate on that last point a little bit? What do you mean?
I suppose, for example, I personally don't mind dude in terms of a reference to me, but bro or man or other generically masculine terms are odd for me to hear. They feel sort of flippant and as if my gender identity is being disregarded. But a lot of cis women that I know don't have that stress. There is no suspicion, or I suppose that's not really the term, expectation that they aren't that. It's just a casual term that gets thrown around for everybody. But as somebody who has been maliciously misgendered, it can be stressful even when it's accidental.
So can you talk some about your coming out experience? What's the process been like for you figuring out your identities?
Yeah. I've never really fit with any kind of traditional ideas of masculinity. Even from a very young age, I was not sporty or masculine in a lot of the ways that are perceived and expected by a broader societal idea of what it is to be male. I think my poor description there is kind of indicative of my lack of experience with that. I did theater, I did choir, my friend groups were multi-ethnic and multi-gendered, and that just seemed normal to me. When I began going through puberty, I recognized very quickly that it was incredibly stressful for me, which, from what I understand, is not abnormal, but there were aspects of it that I anticipated would get better. As a kid, when I started developing facial hair, it was awful for me. It felt horrible and wrong. I didn't understand why I was growing it and why it was growing the way it was. I just told myself that eventually I would get used to it and I would grow to like it. But that never happened. And I can look back on a lot of other small changes in my biology and my life that sort of followed a similar pattern of me convincing myself, you'll like it eventually, this is what you're supposed to do, and that never really happening, but me just coping with it and not really understanding why. For a long time, the idea of being trans was not something that was widely spread and known, so the possibility that I might just not be a boy was not something that I really started to think about until my early 20s. And so I did things that were non-traditionally masculine. I started wearing makeup and trying different clothes that didn't fit in a masculine fashion, but I was still a man. That was definitely how I felt and who I was, and that's what I was supposed to be. I was just not a jock or a gym bro or a super masculine man. And that didn't work out. A bit before the pandemic, perhaps 6 or 7 months beforehand, I started recognizing that I thought I wanted to be referred to as they, them. I started to have more genderqueer ideals in my social circles, and the prospect of trying to understand my identity became something that was feasible and not fantastical. So I started asking certain friends who I trusted to make that change without judgment or without frustration, and it was comfortable. I liked the way that I was being referred to more, and so I asked more and more people to do it. I started referring to myself as such. I changed any online identity that I had to be non-binary. And once the pandemic started, I started having a lot of time spent on my own, away from cultural ideas of gender expectations, and it became obvious to me very quickly that I was certainly not cis and probably needed to pursue further ideas of non-gender conforming identities. And throughout the pandemic, I spent a lot of time learning about what it would mean for me to make the changes that I have been making and I'm going to continue to make throughout my life. And for lack of a kinder way of putting it, tumultuous, awful, consistent mental breakdowns that I was suffering on a near weekly basis for a long period of time throughout the pandemic made me sort of realize that I needed to make a change soon. And so I talked to other trans femme friends of mine, and we stayed up late until the night discussing ideas of gender and exploring things to help me. And it sort of pushed me into realizing that I was trans and that I wanted to medically transition and socially transition. And so I spent the time figuring out what that would mean for me. I spent the time figuring out how that would affect my relationship with my friends and my family and my coworkers. And I thought about how I would want to be referred to going forward. And I picked a name that suited me. And I went through the process of changing it bureaucratically and going through process after process and government office after government office to get things rolling. And it wasn't easy. I'm not going to lie and say that it's been a breeze to sort of shift the way that I exist in the world, but it's been necessary for me. I don't think I would be sitting here talking to you right now if I hadn't made this change.
When you say it wasn't easy, what do you mean?
Just at least personally, emotionally, it was a lot of internal arguments. I had a lot of foundational expectations of what I was supposed to be. I really sort of struggled with letting myself be trans because I thought, oh, well, I don't want to mutilate myself on a daily basis, so I'm not having dysphoria, and I haven't been assaulted for presenting femme in public, so I'm not allowed to be trans. And I had to really sort of grapple with the reality that I didn't need to have specific experiences that I had observed and heard of in other situations to be who I am, and that I got to choose who I wanted to be. And that was a difficult journey because the person I'm best at fighting against is myself. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And it wasn't easy either to socially transition with family and friends. My family's been supportive, but they still struggle with pieces of my identity. They misgender me, they dead name me on occasion, they will never really understand, and that's okay, because they are more supportive than I know a lot of my peers' parents are, and I'm very grateful for that. It's been difficult at work and school at times. As I mentioned previously, I've been at Sac City for 9 years, and I have been working on campus for 5 of those years. And I started working to the capacity that I'm working now at our makerspace before I started transitioning. So all of my coworkers have known me for this entire time, and it can be difficult at times, I think, for some of them to adjust. I know it's not malicious or hateful, but we as people take time to change, and different people need more time. And for me, it's been long enough. My expectations have sort of reached a point where I don't see why anybody should be having issues if they interact with me regularly. But I also have to accept that they are. And I can't force them to change. I can just remind them and hope and be respectful and hope that they are the same.
Do you find that people pretty consistently don't put in enough effort?
Daily. And it's not that people don't necessarily use the right pronouns all the time or aren't cognizant of my situation, but I sort of tell myself that we, as people, often have little rituals that we do in the morning and before we go to bed. And so I tell people, hey, if we're interacting a lot, I work with you 6 hours a day, 4 days a week, or we're related, or we see each other in class all the time, just be conscious of your conversations. I think a lot of people, I like to say, go on autopilot and just sort of their brains fill in the blanks. And that happens more often than I would like it to happen. And I'd like to see people putting in a more conscious effort on a regular basis to be accepting of queer individuals in whatever space they're interacting with them.
So, where do you think you have found the most support and affirmation in your coming out process?
Well, I said my parents have issues at times. They have been incredibly supportive, which I suppose wasn't inherently a surprise. They've never been rigid with gender role ideas. They've never pushed specific things on me in any particular sense. But we weren't particularly close, I would think, until I actually came out. It's been astounding what it has done in terms of helping to bridge the gap in our relationship. They've been very supportive in how they've reached out to other family members. They've been very supportive in how they've been willing to financially support me in particular endeavors that feel like catch-up, so to speak. I have an older brother and no other siblings. So it's been interesting to sort of, in my later 20s, forge a mother-daughter relationship that I didn't really think about for most of my life. And it's been very nice and very just, it's been great to have that support from them. My immediate family has been very supportive. My brother has been incredibly supportive. His spouse is non-binary, so I don't think he's screwed up my name or my pronouns a single time since I've come out. And he's a very verbal, outspoken person. He's been a vocal performer for years. He has a very strong voice that carries well through, I think, natural genetics and also quite a bit of practice. So he will correct people often, and he has, and I greatly appreciate that about him. Um, I found a lot of support in a lot of other social circles. Um, as sort of a non-traditional person in my interests for many years, found a lot of friendships in online communities, and groups of friends that I have had for 5 to 10 years that I have met through online circles have been extraordinarily supportive. Um, and that has been a backbone of helping me come out and helping me explore. Having circles like that has given me opportunities to just say, hey, I think I want everyone to refer to me like this from now on, and for nobody to say, I'm not going to do that, or that's weird, but instead just go, okay, is this still all right? Do you care about this term? Instead of not thinking about those terms. Those online groups don't use bro and man when they talk to me because they know I don't like them. And they asked me. I didn't have to tell them, which has been really nice, and I think is probably one of the reasons why my expectations for my in-person interactions might be relatively high, is because I've had experiences where people have gone out of their way on a regular basis to make sure that they are treating me in the way that I want to be treated. And I just hope that that is something that we continue to do more and more as a culture in various different situations.
Trying to think of a follow-up question. I mean, is there anything else you want to say about that, about finding affirmation and support, or just like finding information as you are sort of, going through your transition and, figuring out your identity?
Yeah, actually, in terms of finding information, something that I have run into, and I know is not a unique experience, is that finding information culturally and socially and medically for a lot of people is very difficult in terms of finding information for queer identities. I have been lucky enough to have online social circles that have experiences or can help me do research or know where to look. But not everybody has that, and it can be very difficult to find resources as a queer individual who is just starting to learn about things and just starting to come out online and in person. It's, of course, gotten much, much better over the past 5 to 10 years, but there's still a lot of stuff that is anecdotal and things that I have learned that I have only heard about through other people who aren't medical professionals or trained psychologists, and I have done further research on those topics because I learned about it from some friend on the internet who happened to know about it, and they have been relatively on the mark, and I've had to sort of really go out of the way to find the information I needed because it wasn't readily available in academic circles or medical circles. And that can be daunting, I think, for a lot of people. I've spent a lot of time in my academic career doing research. It doesn't bother me. I like digging for information and don't usually get bothered or frustrated when I run into walls and have to choose other avenues of research. But not everybody has those skill sets. Not everybody has that kind of experience. And for, say, for example, somebody who's 16, 17, and is just starting to sort of come into themselves and they're not able to get those resources at their high school or in a social circle, it can be incredibly scary to have these feelings and feel like you don't belong, like you are supposed to be a certain way, and not be able to find the resources you need to find answers for the questions you have.
A common theme or thread that's run throughout the interviews, I think, is the sort of lack of awareness, understanding, and knowledge by non-queer and non-trans people. And so when young people are looking for resources, it's hard to find those resources because unless they have a community already of queer and trans folks who can point them in the right direction, they're sort of like struggling to figure things out on their own or semi kind of on their own. Maybe they have some, a friend who knows something here or there, but I don't have a question attached to that. I don't know, does that ring true to you?
As I said, it's not a unique experience for me, is running into situations where it's just really hard to find information. And I don't think that that's specifically a fault of any particular person or any particular group. Although some of the lack of knowledge can be traced back pretty far to book burnings and such during Nazi Germany, and just various other groups of people throughout history who have gone out of their way to make sure that queer literature and medical knowledge has been buried. And I think it's one of the reasons that so much of the information that we as queer people get in modern times is anecdotal, because we just don't have good information that goes back any further than 50 to 60 years.
With structural exclusions, right? Even if say like the curriculum is not explicitly like transphobic or homophobic, but when people don't learn about queer and trans experiences and topics in their own education, and then how are they going to be able to sort of bring that into the classroom, right? So it's sort of like systematic structural exclusions of trans and queer experiences, I think, to some extent.
I would most certainly say so. And it's like a lot of other systemic exclusions, not something that we are made aware of on a regular basis. It's not something that's widely talked about because the group of people that are affected by it are small. And I'd like to see that change.
Are there any specific sources of information that you would recommend that you can think of? Like books that you've read, or websites, or online forums, or anything like that?
I should have made a list.
Yeah, it's hard to think of some specific
It is kind of hard to think of something specific on the spot. You
can also come back to this question.
It's interesting because I've done lots of reading and I've done lots of research and I've talked to lots of people, but I don't think I could name the actual place that I found almost any of that information. There is a constantly updated document somewhere. I don't remember how to access it, but it's, I think, readily available with a Google search and maybe a scrolling, called the Gender Dysphoria Bible, which is a catalog of an individual's experience and the research that they've done on it. And I believe it's something that this person regularly updates. It's somebody's specific experience. They're not a medical professional, but I found it very helpful in my early transitioning because there were things that resonated in it for me that I had thought about for years, actually, before I had even sort of come to accept that I was trans, but had, like so many other things, brushed aside, laughed off. I guess that's a resource that has been beneficial for me. There's a book series by a Japanese author called My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, about it's an autobiographical depiction of this woman's life, and a lot of stuff in it sort of landed for me in what this person went through, and it has also been good to find stories and writings from people who are queer about their queer experiences. I find that for the most part, most of the good information about trans life and queer life is written by queer people, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but it does mean that our sort of medical approach to a lot of things is narrowed, which sucks. honestly.
Doctors just have no idea to
It's,
serve and support trans
yeah,
patients, basically.
it's pretty common. I've had pretty good experiences with doctors in California, but I know that that is not the case nationwide or worldwide by any means. And I find it sort of sad that there are a lot of medical professionals who have a very rigid idea of gender ideas and don't learn about things that aren't inherently new. Um, the idea that there's two options and that's how they treat people is commonplace in a lot of medical circles from my observations and some little bits of experience, and that's frustrating and hurtful and dangerous, I think, in a lot of situations.
So at the beginning, I think you mentioned that you grew up Catholic. So is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Did religion play a role in your life growing up? How so, if it did?
So I was raised Catholic, baptized as a kid, did all the things that kids do when they're raised Catholic. I went to church. I went to a Catholic private school for quite a few years, throughout elementary and high school. I was sort of in and out of elementary school and middle school, both at that school and at other ones. I struggled a lot with traditional schooling environments and with a lot of mental health problems as a child. So my attendance at this private Catholic school was kind of all over the place. I didn't really get it. Even from a very young age, I never really took to the ideas that were presented to me through various religious teachings. My parents took me to church every Sunday, and I hated it. We prayed before dinner, and I didn't like it. It was bad to use the Lord's name in vain, and I didn't understand why. I just didn't really click with all of it. Was very resistant and ornery about my involvement in religion as a kid, and even through like early high school and middle school and into early high school. I went to Christian Brothers High School, and I took religion courses there, and I participated in the services that were held because I was in the choir, but I just sort of did it as because it was expected and because I was graded or because I would face consequences if I didn't. But the teachings and the ideas just never stuck for me. I just didn't like it. I didn't get it. My parents weren't strict about it. They wanted me to participate for my youth, but it started to become clear in my sort of mid-teens that it just wasn't going to happen. And if it was going to happen, it wasn't going to be because they asked me to. And they sort of stopped asking me to go to church because we became busier as a family. We didn't have dinner as often together, so there weren't evening prayer. The expectations sort of dissipated. And I think that because of sort of their growth as people and our progression as a culture, I know from conversations with them, they've become a little disenfranchised with the greater sort of Catholic beliefs that are held by the church, both in the States and worldwide. And I think that's become more and more clear to them as they have queer, now they have a queer child and a queer in-law, and it isn't something that's regularly discussed anymore, at least in my family, and it isn't something that I think necessarily prevented me from feeling like I could explore my identity when I was younger. which I know is a experience I'm grateful for. I know that there are a lot of queer people who have struggled with religious oversight, and it has been incredibly detrimental to their lives and their mental health for years. And I'm just very happy that it was not detrimental to me. The parish that I attended was relatively new age in its teachings. My brother and I joke that we didn't grow up Catholic, we grew up Franciscan, which is much more kind of new agey. It's almost kind of hippie in terms of how they approach a lot of their teachings. So I don't think a lot of the more hyper-conservative pre-Vatican II ideals just never really made their way into my life, which is something I'm very happy about.
So you didn't hear anything negative about being queer from your upbringing?
My parents never said anything or sort of insinuated anything. There were comments here and there from grandparents or older aunts and uncles. Never horribly hateful or malicious, just sort of passively judgmental. I wasn't out as a queer person in high school, although I did know that at the time I wasn't straight. I had started identifying as bisexual in late high school, which then sort of stopped being the case later in life as I figured more things out. So I didn't directly experience any sort of hateful speech or discrimination from religious instructors or parish members or anything in the time that I spent around religious figures, but I did hear it in reference to classmates and friends. I had a teacher in high school, who I won't name, who told a good friend of mine, who I live with now and I've been friends with for over 10 years, that them and their partner at the time were going to hell because they were gay, which seemed like a really cruel thing to say to a 17-year-old who just wanted to spend time with somebody that they liked. I didn't experience anything directly, but I saw stuff like that here and there, and it just has sort of left a bad taste in my mouth regarding anything connected to a greater religious organization. I don't have bitterness towards spirituality or towards people's faiths in general. It's the organized sections that frustrate me, because I think that there's more there than just teachings and ideals and people wanting to do the right thing, and a lot of it is backed up by very old world money and a lot of values that should have been left behind at least 50 years ago.
Anything else you want to say about religion as it's influenced your life or your identity before we move on to the next section?
Nothing particularly serious or meaningful. I suppose my presentational aesthetic almost comes from a contradictory approach to Catholicism. I find in a lot of situations I dress very gothic and very witchy. I occasionally will joke that 500 years ago I would have been a triple whammy to be burned at the stake for being trans, witchy, and gay, which is an unfortunate potential reality some time ago, but I think that my upbringing as a religious person has kind of affected the way that I present myself in an almost antithetical sense.
Okay, so can you talk some about your experience with disabilities?
Yeah, so I have clinical depression and anxiety that I was diagnosed with quite a few years ago. When I was a kid, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. That diagnosis was then rescinded and I was diagnosed with hyperactive explosive disorder and ADHD, which were then reclassified and rescinded respectively. And then I was diagnosed with a sort of generic severe clinical depression and anxiety in my early 20s. And those mental health difficulties have been things that I have struggled with through my entire life. I've never struggled with any acute physical disabilities, but I would consider myself disabled in terms of that mental health umbrella. I was in and out of a lot of medical facilities as a kid and as a teenager. I've had to check myself into the hospital in order to be seen by mental health professionals just because it's been too difficult to get access to anything otherwise. I think that the sort of need to advocate for myself has ultimately probably been beneficial, but it's something that is very frustrating to have had to do. Even as somebody in my early 20s who was very confused about what I wanted to do with my life and who I was and what I was up to, and struggling with mental health in the midst of college and trying to work and figure out my identity, and having those things just be inaccessible unless I was a threat to myself or others or hospitalized myself in some fashion. But having to learn to speak up and be consistent and almost abrasive in terms of my approach to getting mental health assistance has probably been beneficial in me trying to get assistance as a queer person for trans medical care, but that just seems wrong to me. I shouldn't have had to suffer through those experiences in order to get the care that I needed. And I can say for certain that it has been debilitating at times in my life, going back all the way to probably age 6 or 7, in and out of school, falling behind, having to fill in gaps of knowledge that I didn't know I was missing years later. It's been hard, but I find myself in a better situation now, having developed a lot of skills now. I wish I could go back and tell myself that I'm strong enough to get through it, but I can just tell myself now that I'm strong enough to get through whatever's coming.
So how has your depression and anxiety influenced your education, college education, but also, your education prior to college?
Substantially is the short answer. The long answer is that I started having difficulties with my education in 3rd grade all the way back, potentially even earlier, but those are memories that I don't have enough of a grasp on to really touch on. In 3rd grade, I was in and out of school for more than half of the school year. I was placed in children's mental facilities for almost 2 months due to my difficulties and my just struggle with working in a traditional classroom environment. In 5th grade, I was having so much trouble working with the teacher that I had that I asked my parents to remove me from the school I was in. I was then incorrectly placed in the, I forget what it was called, but it was a Sac City Unified program for developmentally disabled students, which was not what my parents had discussed with the district. and I was in that for over a year, which I think definitely caused me to have a gap in a lot of fundamental education because it was just a really bad environment for learning. And a lot of focus was on trying to keep kids stable and functional from a day-to-day basis rather than actually learning a lot of things. Middle school was a little bit better. High school, I definitely struggled with depression and anxiety, and it certainly affected my ability to get a lot of coursework done. In college, I am readily willing to admit that there are a number of days where I skipped class because I just was in a terrible headspace, or I couldn't handle being around people, or I couldn't handle being around myself in a public space. I willingly took a hiatus after about 2.5, 3 years here. I don't remember exactly, because my mental health was in such a state that I could not function as a student. I was having complete emotional breakdowns several times a week, sobbing fits from, at the time, seemingly out of nowhere. I was unable to get myself out of bed on a daily basis and take care of basic needs. I was having a lot of struggles with figuring out who I was. And it was around that time that I started questioning whether or not I was a guy or not, and it was not comfortable to sort of dig into that at that period of time in my life, but it was necessary.
Have you found that you had a need for accommodations while in college, and have you received accommodations?
I haven't ever felt that I have needed accommodations, which I think can be more attributed to me being stubborn than me actually not needing any assistance with various things. There's been professors that I've spoken to that have given me adjustments for deadlines, or had labs or assignments that they have nullified in grades because I have been in situations where it's been just very, very difficult for me to get specific bits of coursework done. Extraneous circumstances, I think, is the term that is usually used. I know that there is a lot of access to assistance, at least at Sac City, from what I've been told by other students and from what I have been offered for help with coursework and accommodations for a wide variety of disabilities. As I said, I'm very stubborn. I have an unfortunate need to handle as much as I potentially can without receiving outside help. It's something that I've struggled with for most of my life, and I've only started to get better at in the past couple of years. So maybe in the future I will be reaching out when I need it more in terms of getting accommodation for academic situations, but for most of my collegiate career, I've just sort of handled it, or I haven't, and I've dropped out.
Can you think of kind of parallels between your experiences with mental health issues, with depression and anxiety, and your experiences with queerness? Either parallels or intersections, and I can rephrase that if it's helpful.
I understand the question. I'm just sort of thinking about whether I have those parallels. I'm sure I do.
Well, I can say that I thought of that question about parallels in part because you were talking about sort of trying to figure things out on your own and seeking accommodations or deciding not to seek accommodations, and there seems like a parallel there to me between that and sort of figuring things out on your own on the other end, really, like as somebody who's queer or trans, like trying to.
Yeah, okay. So I tend to not reach out for help until it becomes readily apparent that I desperately need it, which is something that has affected me in my mental health and in my trans journey. I'm trying to think of a very good example. I know it's there. It's somewhere. It's not coming to me though.
Well, we could come back to it if it comes to you.
Okay.
So how do you think? Is there anything else you want to say in response to that question about how your experiences, mental health experiences, have sort of intersected or have shaped your experiences as somebody who's queer and trans?
Yeah. I think as somebody who has struggled with their mental health for as long as they can remember, I have developed a lot of strategies for handling the basics when I am at my worst, so to speak. I previously mentioned there was a period of time where I was struggling so much with my mental health that I was unable to take care of my basic needs. And that was about 6, 7-ish years ago now. That's not the last time that I've struggled with severe mental health difficulties. There were periods of time during the pandemic when I was incredibly emotional and struggling on a daily basis with my very clear dysphoria. I had finally enough time away from the stressors of day-to-day life and the expectations of regular cultural participation for I think my brain and my body to be dysphoric, and it kind of began to flood in very rapidly. There were weeks, several week periods of time where I was having sobbing fits in the shower every day. I wasn't eating enough, but I recognized parallels in that to prior mental health difficulties that I had been struggling with in my earlier 20s and in my teenage years and as a child. And I stopped being scared of reaching out to family and friends for assistance. I stopped thinking that I had to handle everything on my own. I started to come to recognize that we've only gotten this far as a species because we rely on each other, and that I need to do that too sometimes, and that's okay. And I think that having those previous experiences as somebody with mental health difficulties benefited my ability to work through the angst and the dysphoria that I experienced early on in my transition.
So a similar question to what I asked before, but where have you found affirmation and support in your around your disabilities?
My parents have always tried to be very supportive. I know it hasn't been easy for them. When I was a kid, it was very unclear to a lot of medical professionals what I was struggling with. Diagnosing children with mental health difficulties is something that we are still sort of working on as a world and a country. I found occasional support in various teachers over the years. I had specific ones that were more amenable and supportive to my needs. I like to look back at my second grade teacher, who was great. He was really cool. I had a lot of difficulties with social circles at the time, just really struggling with making friends and feeling like I fit in. I constantly felt ostracized, and I talked to my parents, and they talked to him, and he sat me down with a number of other students, and we really kind of made a lot of great progress with that. And he went out of his way to help with that, and that's something I'm very grateful for, but it hasn't been terribly common. My current supervisors are very accommodating and supportive, but that hasn't always been the case for my employment and for my educational situations. I've definitely had teachers who have been very sort of strict and rigid in their ideas of what is okay and what consists of a disability and extraneous circumstance. And that hasn't been common. As I said previously, I generally would just try to get through it. Mostly it's been family, though. Family has been very helpful and very foundational in being a support system for my mental health. And in the past 3 or 4 years, a number of smaller friend groups have been really beneficial. People who have gone through similar transitions to me or have experienced similar mental health difficulties in their life. So more empathic, sympathetic support systems.
Are those friends, do they tend to be queer as well?
Very often, yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I'd like to joke and say that it's a universal constant that we just sort of magnetize to each other, but I think that it is more in that there are spaces where I have felt comfortable, and those spaces have been comfortable because there have been other queer people there, or because there have been people there who are supportive of my queer identity. I have a group of friends that I regularly play Dungeons and Dragons with, and there is a few people who have left our group because they were not willing to be accommodating to me and a couple other people's adjustments in life. And I think it's that we subconsciously are able to tell what situations we are comfortable and safe in, and we stay in those places. I am still friends with people I have been friends with for a decade because they have been supportive, because they have been kind, because they have stayed up until 4 a.m. talking with me on a voice call in the middle of the night in March, struggling with their own gender identity, only for them to stay up and do the same for me a year later. I suppose it's just that subconsciously I'm drawn to people that are like me and people who will respect me.
Well, that makes sense. Is there anything else you want to say on the topic of disability as it's impacted your life and how maybe it's sort of kind of interacted with your queerness?
Yeah, I think that my anxiety has been very difficult to mitigate when I am suffering from severe dysphoria and body dysmorphia, when I feel out of place socially and physically. It is more clear-cut and flagrant when it comes to a lot of my queer difficulties, when it comes to being trans. I'd say that a large part of my dysphoria as a trans femme person comes from my anxiety that the world around me won't accept me, and that I am not good enough to be accepted, or I am not presenting femme enough today, or I'm not allowed to this or not allowed to that because it doesn't fit my body shape or my facial structure, or I'm too tall for that, or my shoulders are too broad for this, or this color doesn't look good, or that's not a style that will work for me. But I have found through support systems and friends who have been good, and through experimentation, and through uh, oftentimes just kind of telling that anxiety to shut the hell up, I can be the person I want to be, and that my mental health debilitations and difficulties and my psychological disabilities don't define me. I do.
So can you talk a little bit about your economic class background and your current class status?
Yeah. My family is upper middle class, so I was raised not in affluence. We lived relatively simply, but with stability. There's never any concerns of housing or food or medical care being out of reach for us. I had everything I needed, but I most certainly wasn't spoiled. I, right now, am lower class. I work part-time for the district, and I make enough to live most of the year. But I definitely wouldn't consider myself affluent by any means.
So when you say upper middle class, what does that mean to you? Like, how would you define that?
I think that there are federally recognized lines for that in terms of actual income. I don't know those off the top of my head, but my parents own a paid-off house in downtown Sacramento and have for quite some time now. They paid for private education for my brother and I through high school. They paid for my brother's bachelor's degree and for my associate's degree. And they are openly willing to continue assisting me and my brother as needed. Willingness to take them up on that offer is variable. Both of them are retired now, but money has never been something we've had to worry about by any means. It's more just been something to be aware of. My parents taught me frugality, and we lived very frugally, but not necessarily because it was necessary or required for us to get by, but because it was something that both of my parents found to be a worthwhile value that they wanted to instill in their kids.
And you said your current class status is low income. You work part-time for the district, doing what?
I work at the Makerspace at Sacramento City College right now as an instructional assistant. I give tours, I help students with personal projects, academic projects, I'll help troubleshoot software, I'll help repair equipment. We're a multidisciplinary art studio, engineering, classroom, workshop all blended into one for people who are not too privy on what a makerspace is. And it's been a very good experience in terms of employment. It doesn't give me more hours than I've had at other jobs. The pay is passable for what I need to get by, but I like doing it, and it feels valuable and important. It's a job that has been beneficial for me both academically and professionally, and I know that it's a resource that lots of students rely on and need, not just for academic projects, but for a hook almost. We don't have, I think, enough spaces on campus for students to create and be open and willing to try things without fear of failure or a bad grade or monetary a big monetary hit, and they can do that at the makerspace, which is phenomenal.
If you feel comfortable talking a little bit more about what you earn at the makerspace, you said it's passable. Like, do you, if you don't want to say it's okay, but how much do you make in like a month working part time?
I make, uh, when I'm working, I make a little under $1,500 a month, which is just enough to live. And put away a teeny little bit of savings every month, but I don't have a lot of extraneous spending money. Going out is something that I try to avoid doing. I don't tend to buy really expensive food. I don't think I've purchased new clothing that isn't undergarments in over a year. Pretty much everything I buy, including everything I'm wearing today for our interview, with the aforementioned exceptions, is from a thrift store. It's recycled clothing, and I think everything was less than $10 because buying new clothes is just too expensive for me as an option.
Do you pay for housing?
I do.
How much is that?
I live in a home that is partially owned by my parents. So we are triple owners of it. I pay about $450 a month for my space there, and then to sort of make up for the rest of the cost, I do a lot of home maintenance on the building. Sort of accidentally found myself as a landlord, which I'm scurrying out of as soon as possible.
I lived on about 1,500 or a little bit more than 1,500 for over a decade. Well, actually, for about 15 years or so. I found it quite hard to get by on that much money. Do you ever feel like you struggle month to month?
Yeah, I think the only reason I'm able to get by on that is because I have a housing situation that isn't particularly expensive. And that's just due to my parents standing in their almost insistence that they help pay for things. They're very cognizant of the cost of living right now and the financial instability that sort of faces a lot of people who have just graduated from college and the difficulty of finding employment that pays well. They know that I've been working at the makerspace for 5 years and have probably gotten maybe less than $1 worth of a raise in the past 3. I am not legally allowed to work full time because of my standing as an instructional assistant. I am temporary part time, and that is one of the restrictions of it. I am able to get by because my income is low enough for me to qualify for low income medical care, for food stamps, and for other welfare if I really needed it. But I have to be very cognizant of that, because if I make another $200 a month, I won't qualify for my medical care anymore, and I won't qualify for enough food stamps for me to buy food for myself every month. And I will have to pay for my hormone therapy and my medication for my mental health difficulties, and I will be struggling substantially.
So you feel like you have to keep your income under a certain level just to be able to afford medical care?
Mm-hmm. Because if my income were to go up, it's unlikely that it would be going up due to me finding an employment somewhere where there are benefits, because that kind of thing is very inaccessible and uncommon in part-time work. And as somebody who is going to continue being a student, it's going to be very difficult for me to try to find work that is full-time and provides benefits and go to college.
So are you experiencing any financial stressors?
Yeah. I lose income over the summer because I work for the school district. There are sometimes delays in providing staffing budgeting for the makerspace. Um, this year in particular has been very difficult. I have found that my vehicle is getting older, which means more repairs. The mileage gets worse, so the amount of gas I have to buy goes up. Um, Little things pile on and have been piling on, and it becomes more and more difficult to sort of make enough money to put some in savings. I can't really do that anymore. It's been over a year since I've been able to put money in my savings account, which is not something that I am happy about, but it is the reality that I'm living with right now.
So are you out at work? Out as trans, out as queer?
Yeah.
What has that experience been like?
Generally supportive. A lot of the people that I work with have struggled with altering the pronouns they use. I've been working there since before I started transitioning, so a lot of the people that I work with have known me for quite some time. And I know that it's been difficult for some of them to change the image they have of me, be it consciously or subconsciously. And I do have to remind my coworkers somewhat often to use the proper pronouns and to not include me in groupings of like strict gender binary.
Have you experienced, in addition to what you just said, any kind of like mistreatment at work because of your queerness?
I haven't run into any problems because of my coworkers or any of the other staff that I've had to work with. Everybody has been respectful for the most part. Occasionally there's jokes that are told, not inherently at my expense, but I think it's become more obvious to me that there is a willingness by a lot of people in our culture to make jokes that are passively sexist or sort of vaguely queerphobic without even realizing it. It's just what's accepted for a lot of people, and it's difficult sometimes to not turn it into a big issue because I don't want to create problems at the job that I like. But I also have to stand up for myself and for my peers.
So you said you've had the experience of being misgendered.
Yes.
Is that true? Has that also happened in the classroom?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah.
What's that been like for you?
It is frustrating. I put in a lot of work, both in my presentation, in how I carry myself, and how I interact with people, to make it clear that I am not a man. And a lot of people just don't understand, or they're not willing to. A lot of people just sort of let their brains roll and go on autopilot and will say whatever pronoun they think is easiest. Coworkers who will just misgender me because it's easier or because they have known me prior to my transition and they're still adjusting. Classmates and professors who have misgendered me because maybe there's 1 or 2 days where I go to class and I don't spend a bunch of time putting on a full face of makeup and wearing a dress and wearing heels and carrying myself with an air of more femininity. And it can be frustrating to feel like if I don't do those things, I can't be treated the way that I want to be treated.
So what does it feel like to be misgendered?
It's like a little ping of discomfort in your spine and your gut. It's this feeling that whoever you're talking to doesn't care enough about the conversation that you're having, or about the interaction, or about you, to make a small conscious effort to just use a word that fits what you want them to use. And that is usually something that I can deal with. On a day-to-day basis, I probably get misgendered if I don't put in an excess of effort, maybe 3 to 5 times. And that's something that I have come to live with. It's not something I'm happy about or something that I think is reasonable, but it is something that happens. But it's not the occasional misgenderings that are frustrating. It's the consistency of it. It's having coworkers who have known I've been out for a year and a half and still make mistakes. It's having teachers who have actively apologized for misgendering me and then have done it again 2 weeks later. It's speaking up in the middle of a conversation to correct somebody when they say the wrong thing, and then have them say the wrong thing in the next sentence. It's the compiling of all of those things over a period of time that becomes dysphoric and hurtful and anxiety-inducing.
So this is a related question, but why do you think it's important for people to use correct pronouns? And how do you think people can learn to use the correct pronouns?
Well, it's a basic consideration of respect. It's referring to somebody in the way they want to be referred to. If you have a professor who has a doctoral degree and they want you to call them Dr. So-and-so, you don't say Mr., Mrs., you call them doctor. That's what they're asking you to do. That's who they are and how they want you to be referring to them. It's calling somebody by their first name. It's calling somebody by a nickname they like. It's basic respect for the human being that you're interacting with. And I think that it's something that people can and should practice if they think they're going to need to, and even if they don't. I think it's something that isn't taught in a lot of spaces. I had to sit down with my boss and say, we need to have a meeting with the entire staff because people are making mistakes too often and it's disrespectful and hurtful. And there is an expectation both from a like professional but also legal point of view that this needs to stop happening. We have expectations and trainings that are given, but they're poorly adhered to. They're short and outdated. And there's no expectation that you're going to have to show that you've made any progress 6 months later. You can watch a training on how to respect your queer coworkers, but if nothing sticks and you're not doing that 6 months later, there's very rarely an expectation that you're going to have to rewatch the training or that there's going to be some kind of disciplinary action. It's on the shoulders of the person who's being misgendered. It's on the shoulders of the queer person to go out of their way to correct people, to deal with it, to smile and accept it. Oh, well, it's just a slip of the tongue. People make mistakes. Oh, well, that person's a little bit older, so it's taking them a little longer to accept it. Oh, well, they're an English professor, so they really struggle with the pronouns. Get with the program. It's 2023, and there are expectations that are held, and we are in a very culturally, ethnically, religiously, financially, and generally diverse community here at Sac City College and in Sacramento and in California. And it's not unknown. Queerness is not hidden. We're not hiding. And people need to understand that and accept it.
Have you had positive experiences in the classroom with professors or other students sort of doing a good job, kind of putting the effort into understanding the importance of using the correct pronouns, or teaching, right? Professors teaching students how to use the correct pronouns.
Yeah. I've had professors who have clearly taken time to correct themselves, both immediately and from observation, it seems, out of the classroom without me being around. And it's shown. I've had professors who go out of their way to use maybe casual feminine terminology to refer to me in a conversation, which is a nice just aside. It's using terms here and there to reinforce for themselves, for the people around them, and for me, that is who I am, that is how they see me, and that is how everybody else should see me. I've been able to develop better relationships with coworkers because we have a common thread in certain aspects of my developing femininity, and that has been interesting. And generally, it's been good. I think I've had a better experience than a lot of people with my academic career and with my employment. But there's still work to be done.
Have you had any specific examples of professors asking students in the classroom to share their pronouns, or teaching students about the importance of sharing pronouns and using the correct pronouns?
I had a professor who used she/they pronouns, and when we did our introductions online, in our online learning environment at the beginning of the semester, asked students to include those. Asked students to include them when they did their discussion posts. I didn't notice any clear-cut indications of anybody misgendering anyone in the class and being corrected, but it was kind of nice to see that that was something that was being expected. It wasn't you can include this if you want to. It was, please include this. This is a part of what I'm asking you to do for this assignment. This is an expectation that I'm holding you to because it is important.
That professor asked students to include their pronouns in their discussion forum posts and their replies.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the only experience you've had in which that was the case for an online class?
Yes, it's the only time that I've seen it be requested. Okay. I've had other situations where it's been optional, or people have done so. Students have decided to do that. But I have not seen any other professors that have gone out of their way to do so. And I've only been sort of back at Sac City after graduating and taking another hiatus for about a year. I started taking classes last fall for my biology degree. So I haven't taken a ton of courses, had a ton of different professors, but it has been nice to see that there have been experiences and growth with that.
So ideally, what would you like to see?
I would like to see queer identity, respect being an expectation that's clear for both students and for faculty. I think that if 15-minute training video, if that, for staff to watch to understand that they should properly gender their coworkers, and maybe a blitz tutorial and explanation of what it means for queer people in the workplace to be respected. It's not enough. I think that those kinds of trainings should be more substantial. And I think that it needs to be reinforced more regularly. As I said previously, a training video at the beginning of the year that isn't revisited for 5 years is almost entirely useless. If somebody doesn't want to do that, they're not going to. There's rarely going to be disciplinary action. There's rarely going to be adjustments unless the person who's the victim in the situation goes out of their way to stand up for themselves. I'd like to see professors include their pronouns on their syllabus in their introduction. If they go around the classroom at the beginning of the semester and they want their students to introduce themselves, ask them to use their pronouns. Ask them how they want to be referred to. I would like people generally to try to be more cognizant of it. I don't think it's fair to anybody to just make assumptions about who somebody else is based on your pre-existing ideas.
Anything else you want to add
to that?
Yeah.
It might be something that some people might consider to be unfair or controversial, but I think it's reasonable for us as a culture to vocally call out people who are consistent and cruel with their misgenderings, with their detrimental speech. It's not acceptable for a queer minority to stand up for themselves and for most other people to let it happen. I think in almost every situation I have dealt with in both a professional and academic capacity, the only person who has stood up for me and corrected somebody has been me. And that's just exhausting. And I think that needs to change.
So what would it mean to you if you were in a situation and somebody next to you intervened and said you're using the incorrect pronoun?
I would be appreciative. I would be glad that somebody else was standing up for me. I find myself to be pretty good at standing up for myself. I'm outspoken, I'm adamant, I'm very good at speaking my mind. I have friends who have told me that sometimes I'm a little bit too direct, to the point of being abrasive and mean, which is, I suppose, possible. But there are a lot of people who struggle with being outspoken and who struggle to correct people when they misgender them. It's something I struggled with early on in my transition. It's something I know a lot of other queer people struggle with. And it's difficult. As I said, it's very tiring to have to do it every day, constantly. It's a little reminder all the time that people don't see you for who you are. And it starts to become grating. I think that needs to be something we push against.
So when you were in high school, did you ever take a class that included queer and trans topics?
Scouring my memory here. has been like 10 years.
It's not a good sign, though.
No, nothing springs to mind. I think the no. If there was anything, it was so minimal that it's lost to me.
So while in college, have you had experiences taking courses that either wholly or in part focus on queer and trans topics?
A bit more. I've taken American government course that briefly touched on some queer topics from the early 2000s that were a bit outdated. I participated in the choral program at Sac City for a few semesters. And there was, we did some music that was in sort of queer, written in queer space. None of my literature courses have involved any queer literature. I haven't taken any queer-specific psychology or literature or studies courses at Sac City. Done most of my learning on my own or in other spaces. So I suspect those courses are a little bit more tailored towards that, but none of the STEM courses I've taken have approached queer topics to any particular degree. I found that most biological science courses are very binary in their descriptions of kind of everything, which is really strange considering a lot of the scientific knowledge that we have been made more privy to in the last 5 to 10 years. I think the idea of a genetic binary is something that is losing a lot of support and substance as we learn more and more about gender identity and how it ties into our actual biology. And I haven't seen that covered almost at all in any STEM courses here. I'm not planning on finishing an AS at Sac City in biology, but hopefully some of the higher education courses that I run into when I transfer will cover biological topics in a more open-ended fashion. And it's simple stuff like when an anatomy class talks about the discrepancies of biology and just uses man and woman very simplistically as if there's nothing else to it. And it is the curriculum that's existed, but I think it's very frustrating as a trans person to just sort of have to accept that and acknowledge it and move on and not try to be bothered by it. The idea that in an anatomy course, the terms cisgender and transgender never came up, not once, which is strange because my biology has changed in the last 5 years, and nothing in any of the STEM courses I've taken here would indicate that that is even possible, which is a little strange and a little concerning that that kind of thing isn't covered in an introductory and foundational biology course. I know that it is easier for a lot of students and professors to simplify things into a binary, but I think it's doing a disservice to the educational curriculum and to the students that are going through the program to have these ideas just swept under the rug or ignored until maybe later courses or until they're brought up. It's concerning, I think, for students who are just coming into these courses. An 18-year-old kid whose gender who's having gender dysphoria and starts the biology program at Sac City isn't in their first semester even going to have any indication that biologically trans is possible. They'll have gender binary ideals normalized and reinforced from a biological scientific standpoint due to the curriculum at the college they're going to. And if they don't have other outlets, that's what they're going to know. That's what they're going to learn. That's what's going to affect their difficulties at that time. And that's not fair.
Have you been in a position in which you've had to kind of do the teaching yourself in the classroom?
The only on-campus STEM courses that I've taken for this program have been chemistry, which none of them have been organic chemistry or any kind of biochemistry, so I haven't had to do any of that in person, but I've had a lot of online discussion that I have had to do for biology courses, and pretty consistently I have had to sort of put forward my queer point of view in sort of indicating there's a problem with this. I found it frustrating that this didn't approach this in a more open-minded idea. This is leaving out an entire group of people. This chapter on hormones feels a little bit narrow-minded. The biological descriptions for man and woman are not taking into account intersex people, are not taking into account anyone else. It's very, very binary in how it's taught from my experience, and I've had to vocally express that it is not binary.
That's a common thread, I think, that students have found themselves in a position to have to kind of do the teaching, especially around the trans experience, but the queer experience in general in the classroom.
Yeah, and it's odd, because Sac City does tout itself as a very progressive college that's very accepting and that has all of these resources, but they're not apparent in the classroom, which from my understanding is the purpose of the school, is the educational part of it, sort of the primary part of college. And having a lot of that sort of just not touched on in the classroom is wrong, I think. Ethically, I think it is a problem, because it is outdated and diminutive, and I don't want to say actively discriminatory, but it is not being adjusted or revised for our world and the people that live in it.
So how important do you think it is to include queer and trans topics in the course curriculum in general for you to feel personally included and seen at SAC?
I think it would be incredibly important for most classes to be more cognizant of the problems with the gender binary and to not fall into those traps. I think it would be important for professors to adjust language in their lectures and in homework assignments and terminology to account for non-binary people, to account for intersex people, to broaden the way that these things are taught to being more inclusive on a day-to-day basis. Not just everybody use the proper pronouns, because well, that is important. I think teaching from a perspective of acknowledging queer existence is vital, and it's a consistent thing. It's not something to mention at the beginning of the semester. It's something that has to be targeted and specific and repetitive. And it's having queer studies courses maybe be necessary. I didn't have to take one. Nothing. To get my AS here. The general education requirements do not require a queer studies course of any kind, or a gender studies course, or even an ethnic studies course. The only people I know who have taken queer studies courses are queer people, which is strange, because they're the ones that are going to know the most going in, and are going to look for that information outside of a classroom setting. They're not the ones who need it. So why isn't it necessary for everyone?
So if you could, would you, or do you wish you would have had access to, or the option to take a class that was entirely focused on queer and trans topics?
Yes. It's possible I may have had the option, but it wasn't necessary for me at the time, or it was something that didn't fit into my schedule, or it felt, based on the course descriptions, to be very elementary and basic. I've gone out of my way to learn a lot about the history of queer and trans people as somebody who has had to learn a lot of that myself. So taking a course on it as a queer person seemed like I would just sort of be spending time relearning stuff I already know, speaking into an echo chamber. And that might not be the case, but again, I'm not the person that needs to learn this stuff. It's the people who haven't had these experiences. It's the people who don't face discrimination. It's straight people. It's cis people. It's people who are ignorant of queer struggles and values.
Would you take a course that is focused on queerness and transness that goes beyond an introductory course?
Yeah. I think that would be incredibly beneficial, even for somebody who has done a lot of her own research.
What, if you could imagine what course you would like to take, have you given that any thought, or what do you think on the spot of what course would you take?
On the spot, I haven't really given it a lot of thought, in all honesty. I think something that approaches queerness outside of a social and cultural perspective and looks at it in a perspective of legality and how our bureaucracies and our government bodies are built just foundationally in a very binary system in all different kinds of ways, be it gender or a two-party system or an idea that there's two houses and two of this and two of that. We love the number two in this country for our bureaucracies. I think we should work on that because it's not good enough anymore. And I think that queerness in a space that is outside of culture and social circles is not touched upon enough in any way, shape, or form. It's not something that we are supposed to think about or worry about, but it is something that we think about and worry about. It is something that I, as a trans person, think about every single day. It is something that I worry about, is how queerness is going to interact with a trip to the DMV, showing my driver's license for something, having to put a previously existing name on some kind of application. Those are all things that I have to consider. And I think learning about that in a more in-depth fashion would be very beneficial, not just to queer people, but to non-queer people. so that everybody gains a better, broader, and deeper understanding of what it means to be queer in our systems.
Anything else you want to say about the curriculum? So the importance, like your experiences taking classes that are queer, trans inclusive, the importance of offering classes that are queer inclusive, just anything in general.
Nothing else comes to mind.
If you think of something, feel free to add later. Let's see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about campus life as the final main topic. So what has your experience been like at SCC? Like, what do you think the college could do to make, in general, to make trans and queer students feel more included on campus?
Facilities could use some work. There are very few buildings that have gender-neutral bathrooms, and they are relatively far apart on campus, or hard to find. There are no locker rooms that are trans-inclusive in any capacity. Both of those things are difficulties I have had to face. Prior to the opening of the new Moore and Lillard halls, if I wanted to use the restroom and I didn't feel comfortable using the women's restroom, and I was in a course, perhaps in Old Lillard Hall, I would need to walk pretty much all the way across campus to find a gender-neutral bathroom, which, if you can imagine, is not fun to do, and also means that it's very difficult to use the restroom in the middle of a course if you have to get up and leave the classroom, because there's nowhere for you to go where you feel comfortable or safe. I can't take any of the gym courses here unless I want to go home immediately afterwards, because it's not safe for me to use showers in a non-trans inclusive locker room. It's incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly awkward, and potentially dangerous. And that's just something I guess I have to deal with, which doesn't seem particularly acceptable for an entire section of the curriculum to be relatively inaccessible to an entire group of people. Those are the big ones, but there's obviously smaller things that the campus can do to make trans and queer people feel more welcome. Which I'm blanking on ideas for right now.
Well, one person actually brought up having legal support to help students actually navigate name changes and things like that could be helpful.
Yeah, I think that actually would be incredibly helpful. I was thinking in a physicality sort of sense of what literally on campus could change, but I ran into problems for months and months and months with having my profile on Canvas, our online learning software, just revert to a version from 3 years ago. It had the wrong name and a bunch of incorrect information. And I had to call Canvas support several times and send quite a few messages to try to get things adjusted. And it did not stay changed until spring of 2023, when I went in person to the Student Services building and made sure that my name was changed on my employee account and on my student account. I tried to do it online, but it didn't stick. And that was something that I contended with. I had teachers dead name me because Canvas had the wrong information. And that is something that is probably still happening to other students. Having to change those things is a huge pain. Having to go through the process when you are a student who is just sort of getting out into the world is daunting and scary. Our bureaucratic systems for legal name change and gender change, for getting those things adjusted just for your preferences on campus in the online systems and in person are an ordeal. And a lot of people don't have the pre-existing knowledge, the stamina, or the patience or time to deal with those things. They might not have the resources. It doesn't seem like something that would be that hard to put a small little department together for queer support services for students who don't have access to those kinds of resources in other parts of their life, who can't get to a gender clinic downtown, or who don't live in a situation that they feel safe doing paperwork in. What are they supposed to do?
Is there anything else you want to say about that? What you think the college could do to make trans and queer students feel more included?
Um, Nothing else comes to mind right now.
Um, so how important is community to your sense of well-being at the college?
Very. I I probably wouldn't have graduated if I hadn't stumbled into the makerspace 5 years ago, and found a place where I can be more confident as myself. I know I've mentioned that I've had to deal with being misgendered here and there, but it is still somewhere where I feel substantially more comfortable than plenty of other locations on campus. I think that especially in a community college where no students live on campus and our food services are abysmal and extracurricular activities are minimal, I think it's incredibly important to have a sense of community for students, because otherwise there's really no reason to want to come to campus. It's very difficult for a lot of students, especially students who are queer, students who have suffered from mental disabilities, physical disabilities, to put forth the effort and have the energy to come to campus and feel like they can learn effectively when they know that they're just going to go home afterwards because they don't have a community that they feel comfortable with on campus. They don't want to come here. It's something that I struggled with for a while, and having a community gave me something to do. It gave me something worthwhile in those 3-hour breaks between a class at noon and a class at 6 o'clock at night, when I would otherwise have just been going to the library and doing coursework the entire time, maybe sitting around in the quad talking to people for a little bit. But having that sense of community to any little capacity is incredibly beneficial for all kinds of students, not just queer and trans individuals. And I think it's incredibly necessary for us to have that here on campus, in the buildings, on the quad, a physical sense of community. Because if we lose that, then we're not going to stay open.
Do you think queer community has been important for you on campus? Have you found queer community on campus?
Outside of individual friend groups, no, not really. Um, I have had small groups of friends who have since moved on who were queer that I felt comfortable with, but I haven't found queer community on campus.
Um, so I just have a couple more questions. So we do live in a broader context, right, in U.S. society, in which we're seeing state after state pass anti-trans legislation. Has this legislation impacted you at all?
Yeah, a lot actually. Not only that it is scary to see on a daily basis, but also that it affects people I care about all over the country. Um, I could not count on both hands the amount of people I have heard about who have had their healthcare stripped away from them because of the legislation that's happening, who have had to live in a miserable, lying state, trying to pass in some fashion in some state. I have friends who are scared to go to public places for more than 2 hours because they're worried that if they have to use the restroom, they risk getting arrested. It's disgusting. I have a friend who is moving to California and I am going to try to find housing for because living in Florida is a danger to her life. And that's just one personal example. It's happening all over the place. It's not just gross from a personal standpoint. I think it's horribly unethical and goes against the basic ideals of our country. I wouldn't consider myself a huge patriot, but there are points when you have to put your foot down and say, what is happening logistically, legally, and ethically is unconstitutional and unacceptable. And the people who are responsible for it should be ousted, should be shunned. They don't deserve their places in office, and they don't deserve the power that they hold.
Do you think it's important for the district or college leadership to kind of acknowledge this political context that we're in of anti-trans and anti-queer legislation?
Yes. Even if it's relatively performative and somewhat hollow, as those kinds of acknowledgments often are in many situations, it is concerning as a trans individual who is both employed by the district and a student here that there isn't a wide vocal rejection of those ideas. That steps are not being taken to actively and publicly denounce that kind of behavior and try to create a space where students feel like that kind of thing will never happen to them. I don't run into it a lot anymore because I'm very confident in my presentation. I have spaces on campus where there are gender-neutral bathrooms, so if I don't feel confident, I can go there. But I'm sure that there are queer students who still feel scared to use the bathroom they're more comfortable with on campus. And I think the administration can and should do something to make it very clear to those students that discrimination like that is not acceptable.
So, where do you find hope, either politically or personally, when you think of what's to come?
I think about it in a very analytical, logical perspective, which is that there is a trend line that is slowly going up in terms of support and acceptance. we are in a downtrend right now that will not last forever. A wide majority of the populace of California and of the United States are in support of queer progress. Unfortunately, there are a lot of very vocal people who hold a very substantial amount of power who are very derivative and old in their approach to things. I look at it and am hopeful with a sense of defiance and persistence. Because as unfortunate as it is, that is what it means to be queer in America and in our world, is that to be hopeful, you have to be willing to grit your teeth and persist through the hardship. That's how it's been. That's not how it should be. But it is how it is. I can't change it alone, but I can be one little voice that says, this isn't okay. We need to do more. And I'm not going to stop talking about it, and I'm not going to stop screaming about it until something changes.
Okay, I guess one last question. I mean, there are other questions I can ask, but is there anything else in general you'd like to add or questions you'd like to return to?
No, covered a lot.
How about in terms, I guess I'm going to force you to answer one more question.
It's okay.
One, in terms of your own kind of education and career trajectory, what's in store for you over the next couple of years that makes you feel excited?
As I previously mentioned, I'm planning to transfer to San Jose State in the spring, study biology there. I want to be a coroner to some capacity, because I suspect that it will bring me some sense of stability. The science is fascinating to me. Nothing about it really makes me uncomfortable. And I'm hoping to sort of make progress with that. Really find a stable career path, probably with government coronary work. And just sort of see where it's safe for me to live, that I can practice that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.